The illusion of control. The day began as any other, yet something in the air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The clouds loomed overhead in thick, suffocating layers, like a blanket trying to smother the world beneath it. The roads were long and winding, stretching for miles without a single turn in sight. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, to break the monotony. Officer Trevor Barnes, a seasoned lawman with nearly a decade under his belt, leaned back in his cruiser, the engine humming beneath him as he scanned the sparse highway. His day had been slow, dull, even, and Trevor despised dull. His fingers drummed impatiently on the steering wheel, the steady rhythm matching the beat of his racing thoughts. His life, his career, was a string of quick decisions, fast action, and the kind of reckless confidence that had earned him respect, or perhaps fear, from his peers. In a small town like this, Trevor had built a reputation. He was the officer you called when you needed something done right, or done fast. His instincts were razor-sharp, and he trusted them more than anything else. Yet as he sat there, the feeling of restlessness clawed at him. Days like this, with no action, no excitement, made him itch. He thrived on the chase, on the rush of his pulse as he caught the wrongdoers, as he enforced the law with his own brand of unwavering authority. He had nothing to prove, but the thrill of outsmarting others, of taking control, kept him sharp. There was an old saying in the department: nothing ever happens in small towns, just the same faces, the same routines. It was a saying that Trevor had lived by, until today. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where he caught sight of a car approaching in the distance. It was black, sleek, moving smoothly through the fog like a shadow in the mist. The sedan glided past his cruiser, its dark windows reflecting the dull gray sky above. There was an almost unnatural grace to the car's movement, and Trevor's sharp instincts perked up immediately. Something about the car was wrong. It wasn't the kind of car you'd expect to see on this stretch of highway. The roads were empty, the traffic scarce. He could tell that this car didn't belong here, not with the perfect shine of its exterior, or the way it seemed to float above the asphalt. Trevor's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his thoughts quickening. He felt the pulse of adrenaline rise within him. His gut was never wrong. Trevor flicked on the siren, the shrill wail of the police lights breaking the stillness of the highway. The black sedan didn't hesitate. It slowed down immediately and pulled over, its tires kicking up a small cloud of dust on the side of the road. Trevor's heart raced as he put the cruiser in gear and followed suit, his mind already analyzing the situation. He wasn't just pulling this car over because of a gut feeling. He'd been trained to observe details, to look for the things that others missed. And that car, it was an anomaly. The smoothness of its drive, the gleam of the finish, and the way it stood out from the usual traffic on this sleepy stretch of highway told him that something was off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. As he brought the cruiser to a stop behind the sedan, Trevor couldn't help but feel a rush of anticipation. This wasn't just another routine stop. Something bigger was unfolding, and he could feel it. He grabbed his hat and adjusted his belt, pushing the door open with a practiced movement. His boots hit the pavement with purpose as he made his way to the sedan. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, revealing a man whose face was calm, perhaps too calm. The kind of calm that sent an immediate warning signal to Trevor's brain. "Evening, sir," Trevor said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "License and registration, please." The man inside the sedan didn't flinch. His movements were measured, almost deliberate as he reached into the glove compartment and retrieved his documents. Trevor's eyes never left the man's face. There was something about him, something unnerving. The driver handed over the papers with an almost serene politeness. His smile was tight, controlled, not a hint of panic. Trevor's gaze flicked from the documents back to the man. There was a hint of challenge in his voice as the driver spoke. "Mind telling me what this is about, officer?" The question was polite, even courteous. But Trevor could hear the undercurrent, the edge of subtle defiance. He didn't like it. Not one bit. The officer's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents, his fingers moving swiftly across the license. Everything appeared in order, but Trevor wasn't buying it. The smoothness of the man's demeanor, the way he handled himself, it screamed of someone who had been in this situation before, someone who knew how to talk his way out of trouble. "You were driving a bit over the limit back there," Trevor said coolly, his voice dropping with the weight of his authority. It wasn't much, just a small infraction, but Trevor didn't trust this man. Something about him felt like a carefully constructed facade. It wasn't just the car or the polished exterior. It was the way the driver held himself, like a man who had never been caught off guard in his life. The driver didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply looked at Trevor with those cold, calculating eyes. "Is that so?" he said, his voice soft but deliberate. "And you're sure of that?" Trevor's jaw tightened, his instincts screaming at him. The man's words were too measured, too precise. There was no sign of panic, no sign of worry that most drivers exhibited when confronted with an officer. Just a controlled calmness. It was as if he was playing a game, and Trevor was a pawn in it. For a moment, Trevor felt the old, familiar rush of power. He had the situation under control. But there was something off. Something unsettled him deep in his gut. He reached for his radio, his fingers brushing against the device. But he hesitated. A small voice in the back of his mind told him to be cautious. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. I need to check the trunk." The driver's eyes flicked to the side, almost imperceptibly, before he slowly nodded. "Of course, officer. But I assure you, there's nothing in there that concerns you." Trevor's grip on the door tightened as the man stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. Something was off. The feeling in the air had shifted. It was no longer just a routine stop. Trevor could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He wasn't just facing a routine traffic violation. No, this was the beginning of something much bigger, something far beyond his control. The officer's hand instinctively went to his belt, where his handcuffs and taser were secured. His mind raced as he approached the sit-in, his every step laced with caution. He didn't know why yet, but he knew this encounter would not end as he expected. A glimpse into the unknown. It wasn't supposed to be anything. Just another stretch of empty highway. Another slow afternoon. But the sight of the car in the distance, sleek and black, felt different. There was a strange pull to it, a subtle energy that made Trevor sit up straighter in his cruiser, his focus narrowing like a predator zeroing in on its prey. The car was an anomaly in this sleepy stretch of Oregon road. It moved with an almost unnerving precision, gliding as if it were too graceful for the mundane world around it. Its windows were dark, the kind of dark that made it impossible to peer inside, and the gleaming black exterior seemed to shimmer against the dull gray of the overcast sky. In a town like this, where the roads rarely saw more than the occasional sedan or farm truck, a car like this stood out like a sore thumb. Trevor's fingers curled around the steering wheel as his mind clicked into gear. His instincts, honed by years of experience, immediately flared to life. The car was too perfect, too calculated in its movements. Something about it didn't sit right with him. His gut told him that this wasn't just another vehicle passing through. This was a signal, a moment that would shift the balance of his day, of his life, even. He wasn't sure why, but he wasn't about to ignore it. Without thinking, he flicked on his lights, the piercing flash of red and blue slicing through the gray afternoon. The car in front of him didn't immediately pull over, as most people would. It slowed, but its movement was too controlled. The driver wasn't startled, wasn't panicked. There was no rush, no moment of hesitation. Instead, the car gradually came to a stop, its engine humming like a soft whisper. Trevor's heart quickened. He hadn't even hit the siren yet, but already the situation felt off. As he threw the cruiser into park, his gaze never left the black sedan in front of him. It was almost as though the car was waiting for him, anticipating his every move. He adjusted his uniform, smoothing down the front of his shirt and making sure his gun was securely holstered at his side. He grabbed his ticket book, as much for reassurance as anything else. His mind flickered to the usual process. Step out of the car, approach the driver, ask for ID. But this time, something told him this routine wasn't going to be enough. His boots crunched against the gravel as he stepped out of the cruiser, the sound sharp and loud in the otherwise still air. The world around him felt muffled, distant, as if it were holding its breath in the wake of this strange encounter. The sedan sat still, its sleek body reflecting the cloudy sky, as though it were an extension of the mist itself. Trevor hesitated for only a split second before walking toward the driver's side. He could feel the weight of his own movements, each step measured and purposeful. He could feel the adrenaline beginning to stir within him, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was that familiar surge, the one that came with the anticipation of something just out of reach, just out of control. Trevor was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to decipher behavior, to understand the subtext of any interaction. But as he reached for the door handle and it rolled down to reveal the driver, his confidence wavered for the first time in a long while. The man sitting behind the wheel was tall, with a sharp jawline and dark, calculating eyes that seemed to peer straight into Trevor, studying him with unnerving precision. He had an air of quiet authority that radiated from him, even in his stillness. The driver's movements were deliberate, each gesture exuding calm. No fear, no uncertainty. He wasn't acting like someone pulled over for speeding. He was acting like someone who had expected this moment, as though he had been preparing for it long before Trevor even switched on the lights. "Evening, officer." The man's voice was low and steady, laced with a hint of something Trevor couldn't quite place. It wasn't defiance or arrogance, just an overwhelming sense of control. Trevor cleared his throat, pushing aside the unsettling feeling creeping over him. He had a job to do. This wasn't personal. "License and registration, please," he said, his voice firm, his stance one of authority. The man nodded slightly, his hand moving to the glove compartment without hesitation. His movements were smooth, efficient, like someone who had done this 1,000 times. Trevor noticed the slight tension in his grip on the paperwork as the man passed it over. The moment was brief, but there was a flicker in the man's eyes as their hands brushed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Trevor didn't miss it. As the paperwork settled between them, the driver offered a small, almost polite smile. "Mind telling me what this is about, officer?" he asked, his tone soft but undeniably sharp. The question didn't sound like an inquiry. It felt more like a challenge, like the driver was daring Trevor to find something, to prove his reason for stopping him. Trevor frowned slightly. The request was innocuous enough, but the way it was delivered gnawed at him. The challenge was buried in the question itself, an implication that Trevor wasn't in control, that maybe he didn't have the right to ask the question. "You were driving over the speed limit back there," Trevor replied, his voice steady, his fingers tightening on the paperwork as he reviewed it. "About 5 miles per hour." The driver didn't flinch. In fact, he almost seemed amused. The calmness in his eyes never wavered, not for a single moment. It was the kind of calm that made Trevor question everything he knew about power and control. How was this man so unshaken? Why wasn't he even slightly worried about the situation? Speeding. The driver raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "If you say so, officer." Trevor's gaze narrowed. There was something off about this entire situation, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just the car. It wasn't just the driver. It was the way the air felt, thick, almost charged, as if something was waiting to happen. Something big. "Step out of the vehicle," Trevor said, his voice firm, trying to assert his authority. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The man's eyes flickered briefly, a flash of something dark, but he didn't move for a moment. For just a second, Trevor thought the man might refuse, but then, almost lazily, He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out slowly. As the man stood before him, Trevor couldn't shake the feeling that the balance of this encounter had shifted. He was no longer the one in control. And as the driver met his eyes, Trevor couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something much, much bigger than a simple traffic stop. The game of nerves. Trevor stepped out of the cruiser with a calculated ease, his boots hitting the pavement with a firm thud. His eyes never left the black sedan as he approached, his senses on high alert. There was something about the car, the driver, that sent a ripple of unease through him, something he couldn't quite pinpoint. It wasn't the car itself, it was the stillness, the quiet, almost too serene, as if the entire world around him had gone silent in expectation. The usual nervous energy of a traffic stop, the rush of adrenaline, was replaced with a strange tension that made the air feel thicker, heavier. As he neared the driver's side window, Trevor instinctively adjusted his belt, where his gun rested. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he never went into a situation unprepared. His hand hovered just over his sidearm, ready but relaxed, as he reached for his sunglasses, pushing them up into his hair. The man inside the car hadn't even looked at him yet. His posture was calm, unhurried, as if he was waiting for Trevor, not the other way around. When the driver finally turned to face him, his eyes were cool, measured. There was no panic, no uncertainty, just a quiet, almost practiced confidence. He wasn't a criminal, Trevor thought. No, the man didn't look like any criminal Trevor had dealt with before. This wasn't the typical kind of person he pulled over. This man wasn't worried. He wasn't even suspicious. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said smoothly, his voice a low, even drawl. There was something unnervingly polite about it, as if the driver had rehearsed the exchange 100 times. Trevor felt a flicker of irritation in his chest. He hated that calmness. It was like a game, a performance. Something told him this man wasn't someone he could intimidate with the usual smile. "I'll need your license and registration, sir," Trevor said, keeping his voice steady but firm. His hand rested just slightly on the cruiser's door handle, ready to react if things took a sudden turn. The driver nodded, his movements fluid and deliberate. He reached for the glove compartment, and for a moment, Trevor's eyes scanned the interior of the car, his instincts picking up on small details: the lack of clutter, the pristine leather seats, the absence of anything that would indicate a typical road tripper or casual driver. It looked more like a car parked in a showroom than a vehicle used for anything practical. When the driver handed over the documents, Trevor's gaze flicked over them quickly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the information. The name was ordinary enough, Dorian Blake, but there was a sharpness to the way he presented the documents, as if this man expected everything to be in perfect order. Everything checked out, but Trevor wasn't satisfied. "Mind telling me what's going on here, Mr. Blake?" Trevor asked, his voice taking on an edge. "You were driving a bit too smoothly back there, almost like you were expecting me to pull you over." Blake's lips curved into a subtle smile, but his eyes remained unreadable, like black pools of ink. "You could say I had a hunch," Blake replied, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "It's your job to stop cars, isn't it, officer?" Trevor's gut twisted, an odd sensation that felt like both an insult and a challenge. This man was playing him. But how? Trevor didn't let his guard down. He kept his posture solid, unwavering. He couldn't afford to let his instincts get the best of him. Not now. He had to follow procedure. "I'm just doing my job," Trevor said, his tone turning more guarded. "And I'd suggest you do the same and stay in the car until I finish running your information." Blake's smile deepened, but there was no mirth in it. Just a quiet, unsettling confidence that made Trevor's skin crawl. The kind of confidence that didn't come from having something to prove, but from knowing the game was already won. Trevor felt a brief flash of frustration. Who was this guy? What was he trying to hide? The silence between them stretched out for a moment, as the two men locked eyes, neither one willing to blink. Blake's fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel, his movements precise and deliberate. It was almost as if he were playing a game. One Trevor wasn't sure he understood. Trevor had dealt with criminals, with hardened men who weren't afraid to fight back. But this was something else entirely. Trevor straightened his back, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. He had enough of this charade. He needed backup, or at least a second set of eyes. Something was off, and he wasn't about to take chances. Before he could press the button, Blake's voice interrupted him. "Let me save you the trouble, officer," Blake said softly, his tone casual but laced with an undercurrent of authority. "I think you'll find that I'm exactly who I say I am, and I think you'll find that your instincts have been leading you in the wrong direction." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Trevor's fingers tightened around the radio, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just another routine stop. This man knew something Trevor didn't. There was no denying it. But Trevor wasn't one to back down. He'd face it head on, whatever it was. But as he finally pressed down on the radio button, ready to call for backup, a sudden rush of yellow paint splattered across the front of the car. The world seemed to freeze. In a blink, Trevor's face was covered in the bright, shocking yellow, a thick, sticky mess that oozed down, blocking his vision. His hand instinctively went to his face, but the damage was already done. His uniform was speckled, his shirt ruined. And in the car, Dorian Blake's eyes glinted with a knowing satisfaction, like he had anticipated this very moment. In that instant, Trevor knew he had made a mistake, a grave one. He'd underestimated the wrong person, and now it was too late to turn back. But what made it worse, what made his stomach drop, was the realization that the man sitting in the car wasn't just any ordinary citizen. He wasn't just a driver. Dorian Blake wasn't just someone Trevor had pulled over. He was someone Trevor should have never crossed. Under the surface, Trevor's hand hovered just above his holster, his body braced for whatever might come next. He had seen all kinds of people during his years on the force, but this man, this was different. The calm demeanor, the steady gaze, it was like the guy was playing chess, while Trevor was still figuring out the rules. There was an unnerving sense of control about him, as if he had orchestrated this entire encounter in advance. Trevor hated that feeling. He prided himself on being the one in charge, the one who called the shots. But in this moment, that power seemed to be slipping from his grasp. The man in the car continued to sit perfectly still, his hands resting casually on the steering wheel, never once betraying the slightest hint of tension. His face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on Trevor's, as if waiting for something. Trevor cleared his throat, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. "License and registration," Trevor said, his voice steady but with an edge of authority that didn't quite match the apprehension building inside him. The man didn't hesitate. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were in no hurry. With a soft, fluid motion, he reached into the glove compartment and retrieved the documents. He handed them over with a slow, almost theatrical gesture. Trevor took the papers, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the plastic card. The name on the license read David Grayson. The name didn't ring any bells, but that wasn't unusual. Small towns had their share of out-of-towners passing through. What unsettled Trevor more was the way Grayson's eyes flickered briefly toward the rearview mirror, as if checking for something or someone. Trevor's gaze followed the movement, but the mirror was empty. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the action seemed rehearsed, calculated. "Is there something wrong, officer?" Grayson asked, his voice still perfectly calm, laced with just the faintest trace of curiosity. Trevor's gut tightened. This wasn't right. There was an undercurrent of something dangerous, beneath the surface of this man's polite exterior. Trevor wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was toying with him, as though he were the one being watched, being measured, instead of the other way around. "No, just a routine stop," Trevor said, his voice sharper than he intended. He felt the urge to reassert control, but it wasn't working. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably long, and Trevor's eyes flicked toward the rear of the sit-in. There was no other car in sight, no one following, no signs of trouble. Yet something in the air felt charged, like the stillness before a storm. For a moment, Trevor's mind flashed back to his training, the countless hours of practice in surveillance, observation, and tactics. His instincts screamed at him to take a step back, to approach with more caution. But the desire to regain control over the situation, to prove he wasn't rattled, pushed him forward. "Where are you headed?" Trevor asked, his voice less authoritative now, more probing. Grayson's lips curled slightly at the corners, almost as if he were amused by the question. He didn't answer immediately, as if weighing his words carefully. "Just passing through," he said finally, his tone nonchalant, almost bored. Trevor's eyes narrowed. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the creeping sense of wrongness growing stronger. Grayson wasn't just passing through. The way he paused before answering, the deliberate choice of words, made it clear there was more to this man than he was letting on. "Is that so?" Trevor said, leaning slightly closer to the window. He wasn't entirely sure why he was pushing the question so hard. Maybe it was a need to break the man's composure. "What brings you to Oregon?" Another pause. Another moment of silence. Trevor could hear the faint hum of the engine and the wind rustling through the trees, but nothing else. The man's eyes flicked back to Trevor's, and this time there was something colder in his gaze. A faint flicker of a smile tugged at the corners of Grayson's lips, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just passing through, officer. You know how it is," Grayson said, his voice low and smooth, as though trying to lull Trevor into a sense of complacency. "I'm sure you have better things to do than chat with me." Trevor's gut clenched. It was the subtle way Grayson said those last words that made Trevor's spine tingle with unease. It was as though the man already knew everything about him, his routines, his day, his intentions. The overwhelming sense that he was the one being sized up, not the other way around, was impossible to ignore. Before Trevor could respond, something unexpected happened. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, a distant hum that grew louder with every passing second. Trevor's eyes darted to the horizon, his instincts kicking into overdrive. The sound was familiar now, unmistakable. It was the sound of a helicopter, hovering, circling. The noise seemed to rattle the air, its presence both surreal and unnerving. Grayson didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge the noise, as if he had known it was coming. Trevor's eyes flicked back to him, trying to read any signs of disturbance, but the man's expression remained perfectly calm. Too calm. "You're not really just passing through, are you?" Trevor asked, his voice low now, laced with suspicion. This time, Grayson smiled, a slow, knowing grin that sent a chill down Trevor's spine. "Sometimes, Officer Barnes," he said softly, "passing through isn't as simple as it seems." In that moment, the air around Trevor seemed to shift. The faint hum of the helicopter grew louder, as if drawing closer, and the strange unease that had gnawed at him suddenly erupted into full-blown tension. Trevor felt a sudden prickling sensation on the back of his neck, his grip tightening on the documents in his hand. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This wasn't just a routine check. Trevor had walked into something far bigger than he could have imagined. As if on cue, a flash of yellow caught his eye. The helicopter's shadow passed overhead, casting a fleeting moment of darkness over the sit-in. And then it was gone. But Trevor could feel the weight of it now, the beginning of a game that was far beyond his control. The turning point. Trevor stood there for a moment longer than he should have, studying the man behind the wheel. David Grayson's calm gaze never wavered, his posture unshaken by Trevor's scrutiny. It was like they were in two separate worlds, the officer filled with barely concealed suspicion, and the driver exuding an eerie calm that suggested he was exactly where he wanted to be. Trevor glanced down at the documents in his hand, but his mind wasn't on the license or registration anymore. It was on the feeling gnawing at him, the sense that something far larger, far more dangerous, was looming just beneath the surface of this encounter. The more Trevor tried to ignore it, the more it consumed him. There was something about Grayson that didn't fit. Something was off. "Is there something wrong, officer?" Grayson's voice was steady, almost warm, with a touch of curiosity, just enough to seem polite, but not overly concerned. He spoke as if he were the one with all the time in the world, and it only unsettled Trevor further. For a moment, Trevor considered just letting him go. He could always chalk this up to a hunch, an officer's instinct, but his pride refused to back down. He wasn't about to let his gut go untested. There was more to this than a simple traffic stop. "No, just routine," Trevor said, his voice coming out a little more curt than he intended. "But I'll need you to step out of the vehicle." His tone was authoritative, almost daring Grayson to challenge him. Grayson didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Trevor's skin prickle. The kind of smile you give when you already know the outcome of a game, when the cards have already been stacked in your favor. Trevor's eyes narrowed. "What's so funny?" "I'm not laughing, officer," Grayson said, his voice smooth as silk. "It's just, you have no idea who you're dealing with, do you?" The words hung in the air, thick with the unspoken challenge. Trevor's grip tightened on the edge of his cruiser door, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just some routine stop. No, this was something more. A test, a power struggle, a game he didn't even realize he had entered. His jaw clenched. "Step out of the car, now," Trevor repeated, his voice low, sharp. Grayson didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black device, almost like a key fob, but with a few more buttons. He held it up to Trevor like it was some sort of silent weapon. Trevor's eyes flicked down to the device, a flash of recognition flickering in his mind, but he couldn't place it. The silence between them grew, thick and palpable, until Grayson finally broke it. "I'm afraid you don't know what you're dealing with, officer," he said, his voice now laced with something darker, colder. "You really shouldn't have pulled me over." The words sent a chill down Trevor's spine, but his training kicked in. He wasn't about to show weakness. Not now. Not to someone like this. He stepped back, his hand instinctively moving toward his taser, but before he could reach it, a sudden realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The entire situation was changing, shifting, beyond his control. He had been the one to initiate this stop, but now it felt like he was the one being played. "What the hell do you mean?" Trevor growled, his voice tight with frustration and confusion. Grayson smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it. "I think you'll find that I have more than a few connections in places you don't quite understand. I suggest you let this go now. For your own sake." A sense of dread began to creep up Trevor's spine. The man's tone was like ice, and every instinct in Trevor's body screamed at him to pull back, to end the stop before it escalated further. But his pride, the thing that had driven him all these years, kept him rooted to the spot. No one spoke to him like that. Not in his town, not on his watch. "Out of the car. Now," Trevor repeated, his voice dangerously low. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, the rhythmic hum of traffic in the distance. Grayson's eyes never left Trevor's, and the longer they stared at each other, the more Trevor could feel the tension building, tightening like a spring ready to snap. This was no longer just about a routine stop. This was about dominance, control, power. With a slow, deliberate motion, Grayson placed the device back into his jacket and exhaled deeply. "Very well, officer, if you insist." He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the door handle. Trevor's heart hammered in his chest. There was something else going on here, something far bigger than a simple traffic violation. But whatever it was slipping through his fingers, beyond his comprehension. And in that moment, Trevor felt an unfamiliar sting, doubt. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to read people, to command any situation. But this was different. And Trevor wasn't sure if he was in control anymore. The door opened with a soft squeak, and as Grayson stepped out, his eyes locked onto Trevor's once more. There was something unmistakable in his gaze now, a kind of finality, a certainty that sent an icy shiver through Trevor's veins. This man, this David Grayson, wasn't who he appeared to be. He wasn't just some out-of-towner passing through. He was a part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. And Trevor Barnes, for the first time in a long time, didn't know if he could handle it. The fall and the reckoning. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Trevor's patience was beginning to crack, the uneasy feeling in his gut now a knot of anxiety tightening with each passing second. He couldn't shake the sense that this moment, this seemingly ordinary traffic stop, was about to spiral out of control in a way he hadn't anticipated. His hand hovered at his sidearm, the weight of his badge of authority suddenly feeling like a farce. David Grayson didn't answer Trevor's question right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed as if they were engaged in a friendly chat, not a police stop. His smile remained, but it had turned colder, darker, almost predatory. "I'm not going to get out of the car, officer," Grayson said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea for understanding. It was a statement of fact, and it sent a jolt of disbelief through Trevor. The cop's instincts screamed at him to take control, to assert his authority. But something in Grayson's eyes told him that would be a mistake, a dangerous one. "You have no choice," Trevor said, trying to keep his voice steady, but it wavered. He stepped forward, ready to pull Grayson from the vehicle if he had to. But as he moved closer, something strange happened. The air around him seemed to thicken, like the world had slowed down. His steps felt heavier, each one dragging as if he were wading through molasses. Trevor couldn't understand it. His senses had always been razor-sharp, but now they were blunted, muted. The feeling of power he had once wielded so easily now seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. Grayson shifted in his seat, his hand reaching into the back of his car with a deliberate slowness. Trevor's eyes followed the movement, a flash of suspicion crossing his mind. He had no idea what was happening, but he could feel it. Something was wrong. Then the sound came. A soft, almost imperceptible click. Trevor's hand instinctively went to his gun, his fingers tightening on the grip. But as he reached for it, a sudden burst of yellow paint exploded in his face, drenching him from head to toe. His eyes were instantly blinded, his vision a blur of sickly yellow as the paint dripped down his uniform, soaking through the fabric, coating his skin. For a split second, Trevor was frozen, disoriented, stunned. What just happened? The world around him seemed to spin. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was going on, but it was like a fog had settled over his thoughts. He stumbled back, instinctively wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, but the paint only smeared, thick and sticky. And then he heard it, the sound of a door opening, and the heavy, deliberate footsteps of someone approaching. Trevor blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the yellow paint made everything blurrier. Through the haze, he saw a figure moving toward him. It was Grayson. Only now he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. Trevor's head spun. Was this some kind of joke? Before he could make sense of it, Grayson's voice pierced through the chaos, cold and calculating. "You don't know who I am, do you, Officer Barnes?" he said, his words deliberate, each one carrying a weight that made Trevor's heart skip a beat. "I think you've made a very grave mistake." Trevor's breath caught in his throat. The name rang a bell now, a distant memory flickering to life in his mind. David Grayson. He muttered under his breath. Grayson's smile stretched wider, a flash of something dark dancing in his eyes. "Ah, You remember now. But it's too late. The words hit Trevor like a punch to the gut. He had no idea how, but suddenly everything felt like it was slipping out of his control. His thoughts scattered in every direction, but the most chilling realization swept over him. He had just messed with the wrong person. The man in the suit. Trevor now saw the badge pinned to his label, stepped forward, his face expressionless. But Trevor caught a flicker of recognition. "Trevor Barnes," the man said quietly, as if saying the name was somehow significant. His voice had an air of authority, but not the kind that came from a local lawman. No, this was something else. Something far bigger. "Do you know what you've just done?" the suited man asked, his tone colder than the chill in the air. Trevor's mind raced. He had no answers, only questions. Why was he being treated like this? What had he stumbled into? His gaze flickered back to Grayson, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. The unusual confidence, the way Grayson seemed to anticipate every move Trevor made. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. This man wasn't just some out-of-towner passing through. And the more Trevor thought about it, the more his blood ran cold. "You've just made a fatal mistake," the man in the suit said, his voice low but firm, like he was imparting some sort of grim wisdom. The pieces clicked into place. David Grayson wasn't just anyone. He was someone who had power, who operated in shadows. And as the paint continued to drip down Trevor's face, his world spiraled downward. The truth hit him like a freight train. This wasn't a simple traffic stop. This wasn't just a reckless driver. This was the beginning of the end for him, and he had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. Grayson took a step closer, his voice smooth, almost pitying. "I'm afraid your career is over, Officer Barnes. In fact, you're about to become part of a much larger story, a story you won't be able to walk away from." Trevor felt a chill crawl up his spine as his knees buckled, the weight of the situation sinking in like a stone. The authority, the power he had always held so firmly in his grasp, now seemed as fragile as glass. And the worst part, he had no idea how to fix it. This wasn't just about a mistake anymore. This was a reckoning. The revelation. The air felt charged now, as if everything had shifted in a fraction of a second. Trevor's hand tightened on his holster, his body instinctively pulling back, ready to react to whatever was coming. But what happened next caught him completely off guard. Grayson's hand came out from behind the driver's seat, not holding anything threatening. No weapon, no knife, no tool of any kind. Instead, he was holding something small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. A key. The key was simple, silver, with no distinguishing features. But it wasn't the key itself that struck Trevor like a punch to the gut. It was the look in Grayson's eyes as he held it up. It was like the man had just revealed a secret that had been carefully hidden, and now it was all laid bare for Trevor to see. Grayson smiled again, but this time there was no humor in it. No game. This was something else. Something darker. "You want to know what's really going on here?" Grayson said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable weight. His words felt like a trap being set, a web slowly being spun around Trevor, tightening with every passing moment. Trevor's throat went dry. He had been in law enforcement for a decade, seen more than his fair share of confrontations and criminals. He was used to the tension of a standoff, the crackling energy in the air before everything erupted. But this was different. The calmness in Grayson's demeanor, the way he held himself, it all seemed too controlled, too deliberate. Like Trevor was the one caught in a game he didn't even know he was playing. "Who are you?" Trevor's voice barely rose above a whisper, the question escaping him before he could stop it. He wanted to sound confident, but it came out almost shaky. Grayson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the key in his hand, and then back at Trevor, his gaze lingering just a little too long. "I think you figured it out," Grayson said, his voice suddenly colder, more measured. "This meeting, It was never about a traffic violation. This was always about you. Trevor felt a chill run down his spine. The words settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and unshakable. He had always believed in the rules. He had always trusted that his badge was his shield, that his instincts, his control, would keep him above the chaos. But now, for the first time, Trevor wasn't sure who held the power in this situation. "What do you mean, about me?" Trevor asked, his voice coming out firmer, though the uncertainty still flickered in his chest. Grayson exhaled slowly, like he was about to share a secret that Trevor wasn't supposed to hear. "This safe." He let the words hang in the air for a beat. "It doesn't belong to just anyone. It doesn't belong to someone who's just passing through. It belongs to someone who's been watching you for a very long time, officer." The words struck Trevor like a lightning bolt, the truth starting to piece itself together, though he couldn't believe it yet. The key, the car, the calm, the control. It wasn't just a random stop. It was a setup. And somehow Trevor had walked right into it, without even realizing it. "Who?" Trevor began, his breath catching in his throat. But before he could finish the question, Grayson held up a hand to silence him. "You'll find out soon enough," Grayson said, his voice low and final, as if sealing a fate. He took a long, measured pause, and then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "I'd start watching my back if I were you." Trevor's mind raced, but his thoughts were a blur. The pieces didn't fit. The officer inside him refused to accept what his gut was telling him. But the quiet certainty in Grayson's words, the knowing smile, told him it was already too late. The man had orchestrated this whole thing. Every move, every word, and Trevor had played right into it. Grayson gave him one last look, his expression unreadable, before he slowly lowered the key back into the pocket of his jacket. He reached for the door handle with casual ease. "I'm not going anywhere," Grayson said, his voice now softer, almost conversational. "But you might want to." Trevor stood frozen for a long moment, his mind trying to process what had just happened. But before he could make a move, Grayson pushed the door open slowly, stepping out of the car with a quiet confidence that made Trevor's blood run cold. It wasn't just the key. It wasn't just the strange calm that Grayson had maintained. It was the fact that this man, this stranger, had already anticipated every single move Trevor was about to make. And that was something Trevor had never encountered before. Grayson glanced at him one last time, and for a brief, terrifying second, Trevor thought he saw something in his eyes. Something dark, something powerful. "I'll be seeing you, officer," Grayson said with a quiet, knowing smile. And then he turned and walked away, leaving Trevor standing there in the middle of the road, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence.